Somewhere in the oldest part of the Appalachian Range, past the last road that shows up on any modern map, there is a stone building that does not belong to the century it was found in. No town remembers building it. No church ever filed a claim to it. And every land survey that was ever supposed to record it comes back with the same clean, blank square where the structure should be standing. A forestry crew stumbled onto it during a dry autumn in a year when the creek beds had shrunk down to bare rock and the whole hollow smelled like old smoke that nobody had lit. What they walked into was a chapel, but it was a chapel built to face the wrong direction. It was sealed shut from the outside, and it was buried up to its windows in a hardened grey silt that should have taken a flood the size of an inland sea to leave behind. Inside, the walls were cut with a script that has no business existing in these mountains, a language older than the people who are officially supposed to have settled this land. And behind the altar, someone had gone to enormous, desperate trouble to hide a door. Today we are walking into Sable Hollow, and we are going to talk about the most demonic chapel ever found in the American backwoods, and the drowned history that the official record spent 2 full centuries pretending had never happened at all. Before we go one step deeper, do one small thing for me. Down in the comments, type the single word buried. Just that one word, nothing else. It sounds strange right now. But by the time we reach the end of this, you are going to understand exactly why that word matters more than any other word in this entire story. Type it now. Then stay with me, because from here, it does not let go. To understand what that crew found, you have to understand the country it was hidden in. The southern Appalachians hold some of the oldest exposed rock on the surface of the planet. These are not young, sharp mountains. They are worn down, rounded, ancient, the stubs of a range that once stood taller than anything alive today has ever seen. And folded into them are hollows so narrow and so shadowed that the sun only touches the floor of them for an hour or two around noon. The rest of the day they sit in a blue half-light, cold even in summer, quiet in a way that feels less like peace and more like held breath. Sable Hollow was one of those places. It sat at the dead end of a drainage that the state forestry maps marked as unremarkable second-growth timber, the kind of land that gets flagged for a survey once every few decades and then forgotten again. The crew that went in that autumn was not looking for anything. They were tracing a boundary line for a timber lease, following an old stone wall that ran up the slope when the wall did something walls are not supposed to do. It kept going. It ran straight up into ground where the census had never recorded a single structure, never a farm, never a homestead, never so much as a hunting cabin. And then, where the wall ended, the trees opened, and the chapel was simply there. The men who saw it first said the strangest thing was not the building, it was the silence around the building. Appalachian forest is never truly quiet. There are birds, insects, wind moving through the canopy, water somewhere below you always, but in the clearing around that chapel there was nothing, no bird song, no insects. The creek that ran right past the foundation made no sound at all, even though they could see it moving. One of them described it as the feeling of walking into a room where a conversation had just stopped because you opened the door. The building was small, maybe 40 feet long, built entirely of a dark grey stone that did not match anything in the surrounding hills. The nearest quarry of that kind of stone was more than 60 miles away, across 2 ridgelines, with no road, no river, and no plausible way that anyone in the 17 or 1800s could have hauled that much cut stone into a dead-end hollow by hand. And yet there it stood, every block fitted so tightly against the next that the men could not slide a knife blade into the seams. There was no mortar, there was no gap. The stones simply belonged together, the way teeth belong in a jaw. The lower third of the entire structure was swallowed in that hardened grey silt. It came up over the bottom of the windows, as if the building had been standing in the bed of a river when the river turned to concrete around it. Except there was no river here big enough to do that, and never had been. The silt was not local soil. It was fine, uniform, grey, packed so hard that when one of the crew struck it with the flat of an axe, the axe rang like he had hit iron and bounced back and nearly took his teeth out. And the door? The door faced west, which no chapel of any Christian tradition in that era would ever have done, because a chapel is built to face the rising sun in the east, toward the resurrection, toward the morning. This one turned its back on the sunrise entirely, and the door had been sealed. Not locked, sealed. Someone had taken iron bands, thick as a man's wrist, and pinned the door shut from the outside, then hammered the pins over so they could never be drawn out again. Whatever had been done here, the people who did it were not trying to keep intruders out. You do not seal a door from the outside to keep something out. You seal a door from the outside to keep something in. The crew radioed it in. And here is the first thread of the thing that unravels the whole official story. When the report reached the county records office, the response came back that there was no structure at those coordinates. There never had been. The land had been surveyed in 1893, again in 1927, and again in 1961, and all three surveys agreed. Empty forest, no building, no wall, no foundation. Nothing. 3 separate government surveys, across nearly 70 years, had walked that exact ground, and all 3 had recorded a blank square where a 40-foot chapel of impossible stone was very plainly standing. Either every surveyor who ever crossed that hollow was blind, or the chapel had been deliberately, carefully, systematically erased from the record. And once you start pulling on that thread, you find out very quickly that erasing places from the record was not rare in these mountains. It was policy. Let us stay with the stone for a moment, because the stone is where the entire comfortable version of American history starts to crack. Every block in that chapel had been cut with a precision that does not fit the tools the frontier is supposed to have had. There were no chisel marks. There were no drill holes. There were none of the rough, honest scars that hand tools leave in rock, the little bites and misses and corrections that tell you a human being with a hammer stood there and worked. The surfaces were smooth, almost poured, as if the stone had been softened somehow and pressed into shape while it was still willing to move. The corners met at angles so exact that a modern mason who was later shown photographs said flatly that he could not reproduce that work today, not with laser guides, not with diamond saws, not with a full crew and a month of time. And these mountains are supposed to have been settled by dirt-poor farmers with axes and mules, people who built their homes out of unsquared logs chinked with mud because that was all they had. Those same people, we are told, somehow also raised a windowed chapel of seamless grey stone in a hollow with no road, and then forgot they had done it, and left no record, no story, no grave, no name. That is the version we are asked to accept. And it falls apart the moment you actually look at the wall. There is a growing body of researchers, working entirely outside the universities, who look at buildings like this one and see the fingerprint of something the textbooks refuse to name. They call it the reset. The idea is simple, and it is unsettling. It says that not very long ago, only a few centuries at most, there was an older order of the world, a civilization with a level of craft and knowledge that we have since lost, and that this order was wiped away, buried, drowned, and rewritten, and that the people who came after inherited its buildings and were told a story to explain them, a story about frontier farmers and log cabins, a story with a very clean, very blank square where the truth used to be. Before we move on to the carvings inside the chapel, stop for a second. What you just heard about the stonework that no settler in these mountains could ever have cut is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the survey maps they tried to bury. The blank square, the buried windows. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. Now, the door was sealed, and the crew was told the building did not exist, and by every rule of common sense that should have been the end of it. A locked box in the woods that the government swore was not there. But curiosity is a stubborn animal, and within a week 2 of those men came back to Sable Hollow on their own time, with a pry bar and a battery lantern, and they got the door open. And the moment the seal broke, the silence in that hollow, they said, changed. It got deeper. It leaned in. Inside, the air was wrong before their eyes even adjusted. It was cold, colder than the outside, cold the way a cellar is cold, and it carried a smell they both struggled to describe. Not rot, not damp. Something closer to hot metal and old incense. A smell that belonged to a fire that had gone out a very long time ago but had never entirely finished burning. The chapel was one long room. There were no pews, or if there had ever been pews, they were gone. The floor was that same seamless grey stone, and it sloped, very slightly, from the door down toward the far wall, so that if you spilled water at the entrance it would run downhill toward the altar. That is another thing chapels do not do. A floor is supposed to be level, or if anything it slopes toward the door for drainage. This one was built to pull everything toward the front, toward whatever waited at the front. And what waited at the front was the altar. It was a single block of black stone, darker than the walls, so dark that the lantern light seemed to sink into it and not come back. It was carved on every visible face with symbols, and it was the symbols that made both men go quiet, because the symbols were not Christian. There was no cross. There was no lamb, no fish, no dove, none of the gentle old signs that a mountain congregation would have known. Instead, there were long lines of a script that curved and folded back on itself, a writing that seemed to move at the edge of your vision even while it held perfectly still, and woven through the script were figures, tall figures, figures with too many joints in their arms, standing in rows, their heads bowed toward a shape in the center that the carver had left deliberately, carefully blank. Whatever the center figure was, the person who made this altar knew exactly what it looked like and chose not to show it. They carved every rivet of detail into the worshippers and left a smooth, empty waiting space where their God should be. And that blank space, both men said, was the single most frightening thing in the room. Because a blank in a place like that is not an absence. It is an invitation. It is a door held open. Above the altar, cut into the grey stone of the far wall, was a single window, but it did not face the outside. It could not have, because the far wall was the wall that was buried deepest in the hardened silt. This window looked into solid earth, and yet it had been fitted with glass, dark, thick, wavering glass, of a kind that the frontier had no way to make, and behind the glass was not dirt, behind the glass was black, a depth, as if the wall opened not onto the ground behind it, but onto somewhere that had no ground at all. They did not touch the window. Every instinct they had told them not to touch the window. The walls on either side told the story, if you can call it a story, of what this place was for. The carvings ran the full length of the room, and they read like a sequence, like the stations of a church, except these stations did not lead anyone toward grace. They led downward. The first panels showed a settlement, ordinary, houses, a mill wheel, people in rows of what looked like farmland. Then a panel showed the sky, and something in the sky, a long descending shape that the carver had surrounded with those same two-jointed figures. Then a panel of water, of the settlement under water, the houses drowned, the people gone. And then, in the final panels, the chapel itself, rising up out of the flood, and the figures no longer descending from the sky, but climbing up out of the ground, out of the mud, called upward by the thing in the blank space above the altar. Read one way, it was a nightmare. Read another way, it was a record. A record of a place that had been drowned on purpose, and of the thing that the drowning had been meant to bury, and of the people who had built a chapel to keep it buried, and had sealed the door from the outside, and had walked away, and had never spoken its name again. Both men left. They did not run. They were too proud to run. But they left, and they did not go back inside a second time, and one of them did not go into the woods at all for the better part of a year afterward. But before they left, one of them did something that turned out to matter enormously. He photographed the walls, every panel, every line of that curling script, 40-odd photographs on a cheap camera, taken by lantern light with shaking hands. And when those photographs eventually found their way to people who study old scripts, the answer that came back reopened a wound that the official history of this continent has spent centuries trying to keep closed. The script was not gibberish, it was not decoration, it was a real writing system, structured, repeating, grammatical, and it did not match any language native to the Americas. It did not match any European language brought over by settlers. Its closest relatives, the researchers said, were forms of writing found on the other side of the world, in the ruins of cultures that are supposed to have had absolutely no contact with these mountains, ever, at any point in recorded history. Cultures separated from Appalachia by an entire ocean and, we are told, by thousands of years. So how does a script from the far side of the world end up carved into an altar in a sealed chapel in a hollow that 3 government surveys swear does not exist? There are only a few possible answers, and every single one of them breaks the version of history you were taught in school. Maybe someone crossed the ocean long before we admit anyone did, and left this behind. Maybe the script and the builders both belong to that older order, the drowned civilization, the one the reset erased, a world that was genuinely global in a way the ancient world is not supposed to have been. Or maybe, and this is the answer that the carvings themselves seem to insist on, the thing worshipped in that chapel did not come from any continent at all. Maybe it came from the sky, in that long descending shape, and it spoke a language that was old before there were oceans to separate anyone. The people who study the reset have a word for buildings like this. They call them survivors, structures that made it through the drowning of the old world and were left standing in the new one, too solid to knock down, too strange to explain. So instead they were buried, fenced off, wiped from the maps, and folded into a lie about log cabins and frontier farmers. Sable Hollow was one of those survivors, but it was a survivor with a door sealed from the outside, and that raises the question that should be keeping you up at night. If they buried a whole town to trap the thing in this chapel, and then sealed the chapel on top of the burial, what does it say that the door has now been opened? To find out what town they buried, you have to go looking in the places where history is thinnest, where the records get vague and the dates stop lining up and the official story starts using the word unknown a little too often. And in the case of Sable Hollow, that search leads to a name that appears exactly 3 times in the surviving county paper, and then never again. The name was Corven Mill. Corven Mill shows up first in a tax ledger from the very early 1800s, listed as a settlement of some 40 households, with a grist mill, a smithy, and a meeting house. It shows up a second time in a letter, held now in a private collection, written by a travelling preacher who passed through the region and described Corven Mill as a prosperous but, in his word, cold little town, where the people kept a chapel that he was not permitted to enter and that the locals would not discuss. And it shows up a third and final time in a single line in a later county record, a line that reads simply, "The district formerly known as Corven Mill, no longer inhabited, lands reverted." No longer inhabited. Not destroyed by fire, not emptied by disease, which would have left a burial ground, and there is no burial ground. Not abandoned slowly over years, which would have left decaying houses and rusting tools and the long paper trail of people selling up and moving on. None of that exists. Corven Mill, 40 households, a mill, a smithy, a meeting house, and a chapel, simply stops. In one record, it is a town. In the next, it is a blank square of reverted land. And in between the 2 records there is nothing, no explanation, no event, no name of a single soul who lived there or died there or left there. 40 households do not evaporate, unless something removes them, and then removes the memory of them, and then removes the record of the removal, until all that is left is a hollow that 3 surveys swear is empty, and a chapel that was never officially built. This is the pattern the reset researchers point to again and again, and once you have seen it, you cannot unsee it. All across this continent there are towns that appear in an early record and then vanish without a cause. There are cities that early travellers describe as grand, populous, ancient-looking, standing when the settlers supposedly arrived, cities that the official history then quietly downgrades into small trading posts or Indian villages or, most often, into nothing at all. There are photographs, real photographs from the middle 1800s, showing enormous stone buildings, domes, arches, ornate facades, in American towns that were supposedly frontier mud a decade earlier, buildings that no one can now explain who built or how. Buildings that were later torn down and called temporary, and running underneath all of it there is the mud, always the mud, because the thing that keeps coming up, the detail that ties Sable Hollow to 1,000 other strange sites, is the flood layer, that fine grey silt that swallowed the bottom third of the chapel and hardened like iron. You find it everywhere once you start looking. Buildings across this continent and across the old world whose first floors are buried, whose windows sit at ground level or below it, whose original doorways now open into packed earth, as if a wave of liquid mud once rolled across the whole surface of the world, filled the lower stories of everything standing, and then set hard. The official story explains each one separately. This one sank, that one was built in a pit, this other one had earth heaped against it for insulation. 1,000 separate little accidents, each with its own tidy reason, and not one of them allowed to be connected to the next. The reset researchers connect them. They say the mud is one event, a single planet-spanning inundation, not the slow flood of a burst dam, but something faster and stranger, a wall of liquefied earth that came, filled the lowlands and the cellars and the first floors of the old world, and left behind the grey silt line that you can still read on old buildings if you know to look for it. They call it the mud flood. And whether or not you accept the whole global picture, you have to reckon with the plain physical fact standing in Sable Hollow. A stone chapel, 60 miles from any matching quarry, buried up to its windows in fine grey silt that no local creek could ever have deposited, in a hollow with no history of flooding, next to a town that vanished from the record in the same era. The mud is real. The buried town is real. The blank on the map is real. The only thing that is not real is the explanation we were handed. And here is where the carvings on the wall stop being a curiosity and start being a confession. Remember the sequence, the settlement, the shape in the sky, the water rising, the houses drowned, the people gone. Read it as a nightmare, and it is horror. Read it as a document, and it is a town telling you exactly how it died. Corvan Mill was drowned, deliberately. The people of that town, or someone with power over that town, brought the water and the mud down on their own homes on purpose, and they did it to bury something, and then they built the chapel over the burial and sealed it from the outside, and then they left, all 40 households, and never told a living soul what they had done or why. What could be worth drowning your own town to trap? What thing, once loose, is so much worse than losing everything you have ever built, that the only sane choice is to bury it, and yourself and your whole way of life, under a wall of grey mud, and walk away into the trees with your mouths shut forever? The blank space above the altar knows. The two jointed figures climbing up out of the ground know. And the window that looks into black instead of dirt, the window that no one dared to touch, that window is the reason the door was sealed from the outside. Because whatever the people of Corvan Mill drowned did not drown all the way. It went down into the dark behind that glass. And it has been waiting behind that glass, in the cold and the silence, in a hollow scrubbed off every map, for 200 years. Waiting for someone with a pry bar and a battery lantern and too much curiosity to come and break the seal, which two men did. And here is where the story stops being about old stone and starts being about what happened to the people who touched it. The two men who opened the door were named, in the accounts that survive, only by their first names and a last initial, because the people who passed this story along were protecting families that are still alive. We will call them by what the story calls them. The older one, the one with the pry bar, and the younger one, the one with the camera. For the first few days, nothing. That is what the older man said later, in the one interview he ever gave. An interview he insisted be recorded without his face and without his voice, transcribed only. For the first few days there was nothing at all, and he almost let himself believe that the whole thing had been a strange afternoon and no more. But then the younger man, the one who had photographed the walls, began to change. He stopped sleeping. He said the silence had followed him home. Not quiet. Silence. He said that at night the ordinary sounds of his own house, the refrigerator, the wind, the creak of the boards, would simply switch off, all at once, the way they had switched off in the clearing, and that in that switched-off silence he could feel something in the room with him, standing very still, waiting for him to turn and look. And he learned, very quickly, never to turn and look. Within a month the younger man was gone, not dead, gone. He walked out of his house one evening, according to his family, leaving the door open and the lights on and his boots by the step, and he walked in the direction of the mountains, in his socks, and no search, no dog, no aircraft, no volunteer line walking shoulder to shoulder through the timber ever found a trace of him. He did not turn up in another state. He did not surface years later with a story. He walked towards Sable Hollow in his socks, and the woods closed over him, and that was all. The older man survived. But he survived the way a house survives a fire that takes everyone else, standing but hollow, and he spent the rest of his life warning anyone who would listen away from that hollow. And it was the older man who went looking, in the years afterward, for whether this had ever happened before, whether other people had ever touched that place and paid for it. And what he found in the old county talk, the stories that never make it into any record because they are too strange and too sad, was that Sable Hollow had a long, quiet history of taking people. Hunters who went up that drainage and never came back down, in numbers that no ordinary run of bad luck could explain. A survey party in the 1890s, the same decade as that first blank survey, that went in 5 strong and came out 3, and the 3 who came out would not say what had happened to the other 2, and the report they filed, the report that recorded the hollow as empty forest, was written, one clerk noted, in a hand that shook so badly it could barely be read. Children from the nearest inhabited valley, generations of them, warned by their grandparents never to follow the old stone wall up the slope, never to go where the wall keeps going, because the ground up there, the grandparents said, does not like to give things back. And underneath all of it, older than the hunters and the survey party and the frightened children, was the memory of Corvan Mill itself, because the town did not vanish quietly in the tellings that survived at the very edges of the region. In those tellings, something happened to Corvan Mill in its last year. The tellings say the town changed, that the people of Corvan Mill stopped coming down to trade, stopped going to the outside meeting houses, kept more and more to that cold chapel that the travelling preacher was not allowed to enter. The tellings say that at night, in that last year, the whole hollow would light up, not with fire, but with a pale, wrong, shifting glow that came up out of the ground and out of the chapel windows, and that the sound that came with the light was not singing and was not screaming, but was something between the two, a sound that people in the next valley over would shut their windows against and pray until it stopped. And then, in one night, according to those tellings, the light and the sound and the town all ended together. The next valley woke to silence, a silence that rolled down the drainage like cold water, and when men finally worked up the courage to go up and look, they found Corvan Mill under grey mud to the rooftops. The mill wheel stopped, the smithy drowned, no bodies, no survivors, no sign of 40 households of living people, and standing above the mud, untouched, dry, sealed, that grey stone chapel facing the wrong way, with iron bands pinning its door shut from the outside. Someone sealed that door in the last night of Corvan Mill. Someone brought the mud, and whoever they were not among the men from the next valley, because those men found the town already drowned and the door already sealed. So the people who buried Corvan Mill buried themselves along with it, and their last act on this earth was to pin shut a door and turn their backs on the sunrise, and then they went down into the grey mud with their town and were never counted among the living or the dead again. That is what the older man pieced together in the years after the woods took his friend, and it is why he spent what was left of his life as a kind of warning made flesh, standing at the edge of a story that no one wanted to believe, telling anyone who would listen the same 3 things: that the chapel is real, that the seal was there for a reason, and that the seal is now broken, because here is the detail that the older man could never get past, the detail that turned an old tragedy into a live wire. When he and the younger man broke the iron bands and forced that door, they did not just open a building. They undid, with a pry bar and an afternoon of stubbornness, the single deliberate act that 40 households had drowned themselves to perform. 200 years of holding, undone in an afternoon. And the very first thing that happened after the seal broke was that the silence in the hollow leaned in. And the second thing that happened was that the younger man walked into the mountains in his socks and never came back. And the older man was never able to convince himself that those 2 facts were unrelated. He tried, God knows he tried. It is easier to believe in a lost hiker than in a thing behind a window that has been waiting 2 centuries for a door. It is easier to believe that the mud was a landslide and the town moved away, and the survey clerk had a tremor and his friend simply had a breakdown and wandered off. Every single piece of this, taken alone, has an ordinary explanation, and that is exactly how it stayed hidden for 200 years. The reset does not hide behind one big impossible thing. It hides behind 1,000 small reasonable things, each with its own tidy story, none of them allowed to touch the others. Pull them apart, and every piece is explainable. Lay them side by side, and they spell out something that no one in an official chair will ever say out loud. So the older man laid them side by side, one last time, and then he stopped talking. And not long after that he died, quietly, in his sleep, which in this story counts as a mercy. But the photographs survived, the transcript survived, and the hollow is still there at the dead end of a drainage that the maps insist is empty, with a stone wall that keeps going where it should stop, and a chapel that faces the wrong way, and a door that no longer holds. Now, if Sable Hollow were the only place like this, you could file it away as a ghost story with unusually good masonry. One drowned town, one sealed chapel, one unlucky drainage that swallows the occasional hiker. Strange, but contained. The trouble is that Sable Hollow is not contained at all. Once the older man's photographs and transcript began circulating among the people who study these things, others started coming forward with hollows of their own. And the shape of the thing that emerged is far bigger and far colder than one chapel in one forest. Across the whole spine of the Appalachians, and then further out, across the old worn ranges of the entire continent, there are these blank squares, places the surveys skip. Drainages that dead end at nothing, according to the map, but that the local people have warned their children away from for as long as anyone can remember. And in a startling number of them, when someone finally goes and looks, they find the same signature. Grey stone that matches no local quarry. Masonry with no tool marks and no mortar. A structure buried to its windows in fine grey silt in a place with no history of flooding. A building oriented wrong, sealed wrong, hidden from the record. And a story, always at the very edge of local memory, about a town that used to be there and then in one night was not. The Reset researchers assembled these accounts into a map of their own, a map of the places the official map refuses to see, and when they laid that map down over the known history of the continent, a pattern surfaced that made several of them stop sleeping as well. The blank squares are not random. They cluster along the oldest ranges, in the deepest, most cut-off hollows, in exactly the places where an older order of the world would have hidden the things it most needed to keep buried. It is as if someone, at the moment of the reset, went through the land like a gardener pulling weeds, and every place that held one of these chapels was drowned, sealed, and then carefully, patiently erased from every map that would ever be drawn afterward. And that is the part that turns this from folklore into something that should genuinely frighten a thinking person. Because a flood is a natural disaster, mud is geology, a town dying is a tragedy, but a map is a decision. Somebody has to choose to leave the square blank. Somebody has to survey that hollow in 1893, and again in 1927, and again in 1961, stand in front of a 40-foot chapel of impossible stone, and write down the word empty 3 times, across 70 years, by 3 different people who almost certainly never met. That is not an accident. That is not a mistake repeated. That is a policy, handed down, enforced, obeyed. Somebody in every one of those decades knew what was in that hollow, and knew that the correct thing to write on the map was nothing. Who? That is the question that has no comfortable answer. The Reset researchers have their theories, and the theories run from the almost plausible to the deeply strange, and honestly, all of them are speculation, and you should hold every one of them at arm's length, because certainty is exactly the trap this kind of story sets for you. But the theories are worth hearing, because even the wildest of them is trying to explain a real hole in the record, a hole shaped exactly like a chapel that officially does not exist. The gentlest theory says it is bureaucratic inertia, that once a place is recorded as empty, it stays recorded as empty, and every later surveyor just copies the older map rather than tramping up a miserable dead-end drainage to check. It is the most comfortable theory. It is also the weakest, because it does not explain the iron bands on the door, or the drowned town, or the men who walked into the mountains in their socks. And it requires you to believe that 3 generations of surveyors all independently chose not to mention a large stone building standing directly in front of them. The middle theory says there is, and has long been, a quiet office somewhere, an old and boring seeming arm of the record-keeping apparatus, whose actual job is to make sure certain places stay off the map. Not a dramatic conspiracy, a dull one, a filing decision, renewed every few decades, that certain coordinates are to be marked empty, and certain reports are to be shelved, and certain photographs are to be lost. The people carrying out the policy might not even know why. They might just know that the hollow is flagged, and that flagged hollows get the word empty, and that curious people who ask too many questions about flagged hollows tend to be moved to other work. This is the theory the older man came to believe, and it is the one that fits the paperwork best, and it is also the one that should make the back of your neck cold, because it means the burying is not over. It means someone is still, right now, keeping the squares blank. And then there is the deepest theory, the one that takes the carvings on the wall completely at their word. This theory says that the blanking of the map is not the work of an office at all, or at least not only. It says that the things drowned in these hollows have a reach, that they can lean on a mind the way the silence leaned on the younger man, and that the surveyors who wrote empty over a standing chapel did so because when they stood in that hollow, some part of them was told, without words, in that switched-off silence, that they had seen nothing, that there was nothing here, that the correct word was empty, and they came down the mountain and wrote it, and never quite knew why their hand had been shaking. This theory says the buried things guard their own graves, that the seal on the door and the blank on the map are the same act, performed at two different scales, and that both of them have started, quietly, to fail. You do not have to accept any of these. You should not accept any of these on my say-so. What you cannot do, if you are honest, is accept the version where none of this happened, because the physical facts do not permit it. The stone is real, the mud is real, the blank surveys are real. Sitting in a county office with a chapel standing on the ground they call empty. The photographs of the carvings are real, and the script in them is real, and it matches writing from the far side of an ocean it should never have crossed. The vanished town is real, 3 lines of ink and then silence, where 40 households used to be. Every single one of those facts is documented, and every single one of them is impossible under the history we were taught, and the only way to make them all disappear is to do exactly what has been done for 200 years. Take them one at a time. Give each one a small, tidy, separate reason, and never, ever lay them side by side. We just laid them side by side, and once you have seen the shape they make, the comfortable version is gone for good, and you start to look at the ordinary land around you a little differently. That dead-end road near where you grew up, the one that just stops in the trees for no reason anyone ever explained. That old foundation in the woods that the county has no record of. That stretch of your own local map that has always been, now that you think about it, strangely, perfectly, blank. How many of them are just land, and how many of them are hollows? There was one more expedition to Sable Hollow that we know of, years after the older man died, and it is the account of that expedition that gives this story its final, worst shape. A small group went in. Not a film crew, not thrill seekers, but a handful of people who had studied the older man's transcript until they knew it by heart, and who wanted to do the one thing he had begged everyone never to do, which was to go and reseal the door. They found the hollow exactly as it had been described, the stone wall that keeps going, the clearing with no birdsong, the chapel, facing west, buried to its windows in grey silt gone hard as iron, and the door, standing open, the way the 2 men had left it, the iron bands hanging broken and bent, the dark of the interior spilling out into the failing afternoon light like something poured. They went in, and what they reported was that the room was worse than the transcript had prepared them for, not because anything had changed, but because everything was exactly the same, and things that sit unchanged for 200 years in a place where 2 centuries should have brought dust and decay and the slow, patient ruin of everything are not natural, and the mind knows it. The altar was clean. The carvings were sharp, uneroded, as if cut that morning. The sloping floor still pulled the eye down toward the front, and the window above the altar still looked into black, and the black, they said, was no longer entirely still. That is the detail. That is the thing that the last account adds, and that no one who has heard it has ever quite been able to put down. When the 2 men opened the door, the window looked into a depth, a dark, a nothing behind the wavering glass. When this last group came, years later, after 2 centuries of the seal, and then years of the seal being broken, the dark behind the glass had, in the words of the person who wrote it down, come closer. Not moved, not rushed. Come closer, the way the far end of a long hallway comes closer as you keep walking toward it, except no one was walking. The black had simply, over those years, drawn nearer to the glass, and there was now, low down in it, the faint suggestion of a shape, tall, wrong, jointed, patient, at the very edge of being seen. They did not reseal the door. They tried. They had brought iron, they had brought tools, they had a plan, and they had the older man's warning driving them. And when they stood in that room in front of that window, they found that they could not make themselves do it, because to reseal the door you have to turn your back on the altar and work, and not one of them could bear to turn their back on the altar for as long as the work would take. The silence leaned in, the switched off, listening silence that everyone who enters that place describes. And they left, all of them, walking backward out of the door, and the last one out swore that as the light left the room the shape in the window rose, slightly, the way a person rises when someone they have been waiting for finally arrives. They left the door open. It is, as far as anyone knows, still open. And that is where the documented part of this story ends, with a broken seal, a drawn-near dark, and a room full of carved worshippers gathered around a blank space that is no longer entirely empty. So what do we actually have? Strip away every interpretation, every theory, every frightened embellishment, and stand only on what can be pointed to, and this is what remains. A stone chapel that no local materials, tools, or labour of the settlement era can account for. A layer of hardened grey flood silt burying it in a place with no floods. A town, Corvan Mill, that exists in 3 lines of record and then ceases to exist with no cause, no bodies, and no burial ground. A door sealed from the outside with iron to trap rather than exclude. A wall of carvings in a script that belongs to the other side of the world. 3 government surveys that recorded a standing building as empty land. And a chain of people, across 2 centuries, who went up that drainage and did not come down, or came down changed. Every one of those things is real. Not one of them fits the history you were taught, and the discipline, the only honest discipline here, is to hold both of those truths at once. To refuse the lazy comfort of dismissing it all, and to refuse the equal, opposite comfort of believing all of it, and to sit instead in the hard, uncomfortable middle where the facts are undeniable and the explanation is missing. That missing explanation is the shape of the reset. It is the exact size and shape of the hole that a rewritten history leaves behind. And Sable Hollow is one place where the ground did not quite finish swallowing the evidence, where a wall of stone was too stubborn to sink and a layer of mud preserved instead of destroyed, and where, because of a timber lease and a dry autumn and 2 curious men, we got to look, for a moment, into the blank square on the map and see that it was never empty at all. The people who kept that square blank for 200 years were not fools, and they were not lying for fun. Whatever their reasons, whatever chain of offices or drowned things enforced that blankness, they were, in their own terrible way, protecting us. A sealed door is a kindness aimed at the future, and the 2 men with the pry bar, and the group who could not turn their backs long enough to reseal it, undid that kindness, and the dark behind the glass has been coming closer ever since, slowly, patiently, on a schedule measured not in the years of a human life but in the long, cold, geologic patience of whatever it was that a whole town chose to drown itself rather than let loose. Let me take you back to the script on the walls, because that script is the thread that ties Sable Hollow to the largest and strangest claim in this whole field, and I want to walk it carefully, because this is where speculation runs hottest and where you most need to keep your feet. When the photographs of the carvings reached people who spend their lives with old writing systems, the reaction split into 2 camps, and the split itself is telling. One camp said the script was a hoax, an invented alphabet, decorative nonsense meant to look ancient. But the people in that camp could not explain why the nonsense repeated with the strict internal consistency of a real grammar, why certain marks always followed certain others, why the whole wall behaved like language and not like doodling. The other camp, the ones who took it seriously, found something worse than a hoax. They found resemblance. Not identity, but resemblance, to writing systems from cultures scattered across the far side of the world, cultures that had no ocean-going contact with these mountains, cultures separated from Appalachia by water and by time in every version of history we are allowed to teach. Now, there is an easy way to explain a single resemblance. Coincidence. Human beings make similar marks. Fine. But Sable Hollow is not a single resemblance. It sits inside a much wider pattern of things that keep turning up on the wrong continent. Structures in the American landscape aligned to the stars the way the monuments of the Old World are aligned. Stonework techniques on this continent that mirror stonework techniques an ocean away, the same seamless fitting, the same impossible precision, the same absence of the tool marks that honest labour leaves behind. And now a script, carved into an altar in a drowned hollow, that reads like a cousin of writing from the other side of the earth. The reset thesis takes all of this and offers one enormous, unprovable, and deeply uncomfortable explanation. It says that before the drowning, the world was not the patchwork of isolated cultures we are taught it was. It says there was an older order that was genuinely global, that shared a way of building and a way of writing and, perhaps, a way of worshipping from one end of the earth to the other, and that this older order was ended, all at once, by the mud and buried, and then divided up in the retelling into 100 separate ancient peoples who supposedly never spoke to one another. In that version, the script at Sable Hollow is not out of place at all. It is a fragment of the common tongue of a drowned world, left in a hollow too remote for the erasers to reach in time, whispering that the old world was one thing, and that we are the confused, orphaned children of its ending, handed a story about log cabins and told to be grateful. And that word, orphaned, is not an accident either, because the orphans are part of this too. One of the quiet, genuinely documented strangenesses of the era right around these vanishings is the sheer number of children with no origin. Across the same decades that towns like Corvan Mill were slipping out of the record, there are accounts of enormous numbers of orphaned and displaced children being moved, resettled, redistributed, children whose parents and hometowns are simply blank in the paperwork. The official history has its explanations, and some of them are ordinary and sad and true. But the reset researchers look at that river of parentless children flowing out of exactly the era when whole towns were being drowned and erased, and they ask a question that is hard to unask. If you wanted to end an old world and start a new story, and you had just drowned the adults who remembered the old world, what would you do with all the children who were left? You would move them somewhere they had no roots, you would give them a new history, and in a generation, the old world would be gone, not just from the map, but from every living memory. And the only thing left of it would be a few stubborn stone survivors standing in hollows you had marked empty. I want to be honest with you about what that paragraph is. It is speculation stacked on speculation. It takes real documented facts, the vanished towns, the flood silt, the impossible masonry, the displaced children, the out-of-place script, and it strings them onto a single narrative, and no one can prove that the string is real. The mainstream historian would tell you that each of those facts has its own separate, mundane cause, and that lacing them together is a story we tell because the true, scattered explanations are boring, and a single dark thread is thrilling. And the mainstream historian might be right. You have to hold that possibility open, honestly, all the way through, or you are not thinking, you are just being frightened on cue. But here is what the mainstream historian cannot do. And it is the same thing they could not do at Sable Hollow. They cannot make the stone go away. They cannot make the mud go away. They cannot explain how a script from the far side of the world ends up on an altar in a hollow the surveys call empty, in a chapel built with a precision they admit they cannot match today, above a town that ceased to exist without leaving a single grave. They can dismiss the thread. They cannot dismiss the beads on it. And a person is allowed, without shame, to look at a row of impossible facts and say, I do not know what connects these, but I no longer believe the story that says they are unconnected. That is the honest posture. Not belief, not dismissal, refusal of the blank square, because the blank square is the lie. Whatever the truth of Sable Hollow is, whether it is a drowned demon or a drowned civilization or a chain of tragic coincidences that the human mind insists on braiding into a monster, the one thing it is not is empty. It was never empty. Somebody needed you to believe it was empty. And the moment you stop believing that, the moment you start seeing the blank squares as answers rather than as absences, the whole comfortable map of the world you were handed begins, very quietly, to come apart in your hands. There is one more piece of the Sable Hollow account that belongs here, because it connects the chapel to the strangest single claim in all of reset lore, the claim about light. Remember the tellings from the next valley, the ones that described Corvan Mills last year. They spoke of a pale, wrong glow that came up out of the ground and out of the chapel windows at night, a light with no fire behind it. the reset researchers seize on that, because a recurring thread in their whole picture of the old world is that it had light without flame, energy drawn out of the ground or the air itself, a lost way of powering the world that the drowning took with it. They point at the old buildings with their strange spires and their unexplained ornament, and they say, those were not decoration, those were apparatus, and the world they lit is the world that went under the mud. And a cold chapel in a remote hollow, glowing at night with a light that had no fire, drawing something up out of the dark behind a window, is exactly the kind of place where that lost apparatus, in this telling, was turned to a use it was never meant for, and where it finally had to be drowned to be stopped. So where does all of this leave you, sitting wherever you are sitting, having followed a stone wall up an imaginary slope into a hollow you will almost certainly never visit? It leaves you, I think, with a different way of seeing the ground under your own feet, and that is worth more than any single scare, because the scare fades and the way of seeing does not. Start with the maps. We treat maps as neutral, as simple pictures of what is there, and they are nothing of the kind. A map is a set of decisions about what counts as real. Every map has an author, and every author has left things off, and most of the time those omissions are innocent, a stream too small to draw, a shed not worth marking. But some omissions are not innocent, and the terrifying thing about an omission is that it is invisible by design. You cannot see what has been left off a map by looking at the map. You can only see it by standing on the ground the map calls empty and noticing that the ground disagrees. That is what a timber crew did in Sable Hollow. They stood on empty and found it occupied. And once you know that can happen, you cannot look at the blank spaces on any map the same way again. Look at your own region. Every part of this continent, and most of the old world besides, has its version of Sable Hollow, its dead-end road that stops in the trees, its stretch of woods the old people warned the children away from, its foundation with no record, its town that used to be there, and then, one census to the next, was not. You have probably driven past 3 of them this year without a second glance. The reset does not live in one dramatic hollow in the mountains. It lives in the accumulated small blanks of the ordinary world, the places we have all been trained to slide our eyes across, the empty squares we never think to question. And the training runs deep, because the training is most of what school ever taught us about the past. A clean story, a tidy line of progress, log cabins becoming towns, becoming cities, nothing before, nothing hidden, nothing drowned. A story with no blank squares in it at all, which is the one thing we now know for certain the real past is full of. I am not telling you to believe in a demon behind a window. I am telling you something both smaller and larger than that. I am telling you that the official history of this continent has holes in it big enough to lose a town in, and that we have documented physical, pointable proof that at least one such town was lost, drowned, sealed, and erased, and that the machinery of erasure was still marking that hollow empty as recently as the 1960s. Whether the thing they buried there was a demon or a machine or a memory, the burying was real, and the covering up of the burying was real, and if it happened once in one hollow, the honest mind has to ask how many other hollows are out there wearing the word empty like a lid. And that is the true horror of Sable Hollow, the one that outlasts the ghost story. It is not the shape in the window, it is the word on the map. It is the discovery that empty is not a description, it is sometimes an instruction, a thing written on purpose to make you look away, and that we have all spent our whole lives obeying it without ever once noticing we were being told to. The demon, if there is a demon, is behind one window in one hollow, and the door is only open a crack, and the dark is coming closer only slowly. But the blank squares are everywhere, and the instruction to ignore them is written into the maps in our schools, and the maps on our phones, and the maps in our heads, and we follow it every single day. Now think about the 2 men one more time. They did a foolish thing. They took a pry bar to a door that 40 households had drowned themselves to seal, and one of them paid for it by walking into the mountains in his socks and never coming back. It is easy to call them reckless, and they were, but look at what their recklessness bought. Before those 2 men, Sable Hollow was a perfect erasure. A blank square, a sealed door, a drowned town, a silence that had held for 200 years, a piece of the real past so completely swallowed that the world above it did not even know it was missing a tooth. And then two stubborn men with a lantern refused the blank square and forced the door and photographed the walls, and one of them lived long enough to lay the facts side by side and hand them to us. The seal they broke was terrible to break, but the silence they broke needed breaking, because a silence that swallows a town and then swallows the memory of the town is not peace. It is a wound that has healed over a splinter, and the only way to ever be free of the splinter is to open the wound. We are, all of us, downstream of a very old wound that healed over a very large splinter. The drowned world, whatever it truly was, is down there under the mud and under the story, and every hollow like Sable is a place where the splinter comes close enough to the surface to feel. You can pretend you never felt it. Most people will. Most people will finish this, and feel the cold go up their spine, and then let the ordinary world close comfortably back over the top of it, because the ordinary world is warm and the drowned one is not, and who could blame them? But some of you will not be able to let it close. Some of you have already started, somewhere in the back of your mind, running down the list of blank squares in your own life, the road that stops, the woods you were warned away from, the foundation with no name. And you are already, quietly, refusing the word empty, which is exactly where every person who ever pulled a thread like this one began, because that is the thing about the blank square. It only works if no one looks. The whole 200-year erasure of Corvan Mill held perfectly. Right up until the afternoon, a few ordinary men followed a wall a little too far and looked at ground they had been told was nothing. The lid stays on the pot only as long as everyone agrees to see a lid and not a pot, and there are more of us looking now than there have ever been. More eyes on the old maps, more people standing on the empty squares and noticing the ground disagree, more strangers comparing hollows across a distance the erasers never planned for. The seal on Sable Hollow is broken, but so is a larger seal, the seal of silence itself, the agreement to look away, and that second broken seal may matter more than the first, because a demon behind a window can only take the people foolish enough to open its door. But a true history, once it starts coming up out of the mud, takes everyone. Before we come to the end, there is one more part of the record worth walking through slowly, because it is the part that shows the erasure did not stop in the 1800s. It shows the erasure working in living memory, on this very case, on the evidence itself. Consider the photographs. The younger man took some 40 of them, the whole cycle of carvings, before the mountains took him. Those photographs are the single most important piece of physical evidence in the entire account, because they are the only reason we can say anything at all about the script, the altar, the sequence of drowned panels. And yet, when you try to trace those photographs through the years, they behave exactly the way evidence behaves when someone does not want it to survive. The originals are gone. Not destroyed in any dramatic way, simply gone, misplaced, lost in a house fire that took the younger man's family records, absent from the collections where they should be. What survives are copies of copies, passed hand to hand, degraded a little more with each pass, so that the very thing that proves the chapel is also, conveniently, the thing that is always one generation too blurred to be examined properly. That is not proof of a conspiracy, but it is exactly the fingerprint a conspiracy would leave, and it is the same fingerprint you find on so many of these cases. The evidence never gets seized. It never gets denounced. It just quietly, gently, always fails to reach the people who could confirm it. Consider the mud. A sample of that hardened grey silt was taken, once by someone who understood that it was the key to everything, because if you could show that the flood layer at Sable Hollow matched flood layers at other impossible sites across the continent, you would have physical, testable, undeniable proof of a single shared event. That sample was sent for analysis, and the account says only that the results never came back, that the laboratory had no record of receiving it, that the person who sent it was told, politely, that no such sample had ever arrived. One lost envelope. Perfectly ordinary. Envelopes go missing every day. But it was that envelope. It is always that envelope. The one carrying the thing that could have tied the beads together into a thread that even the official world would have had to look at. Consider the surveys themselves. The 3 blank surveys, 1893 and 1927 and 1961. Those, at least, still exist, sitting in a county office, recording empty land where a chapel stands. And that is the strangest survival of all, because you would think the blank surveys would be the first thing to disappear, being the clearest proof that the record and the ground do not agree. But they stay. And the reason they stay, the reset researchers argue, is precisely that they are blank. A blank survey is not evidence of the chapel. It is evidence of nothing, which is exactly what it was designed to be. It can sit in the open forever, because reading it correctly requires you to already know what is not on it, and almost no one does. The lie hides in plain sight because the lie is an absence, and you cannot photograph an absence, you cannot sample it, you cannot send it to a laboratory. You can only stand on the ground it denies and feel the cold come up through your boots. That is the machinery, not black helicopters and men in suits, lost envelopes, house fires, blurred copies, samples that never arrive, surveys that stay because they say nothing. 1,000 small, deniable, individually innocent failures, each one easy to explain, that add up, across 2 centuries, to a chapel that officially does not exist and a town that officially never died. And every one of those small failures happened to the one piece of evidence that mattered most at the moment it mattered most. Call that coincidence if you can still manage to. The older man could not. By the end, he had watched too many envelopes go missing to believe in luck. There is a passage near the end of the older man's transcript that his interviewer almost cut, because it did not add any facts, and because when he spoke it his voice, even in cold print, changes. He had finished laying out the whole chain of it, the stone and the mud and the town and the door and the friend the mountains took, and the interviewer asked him the obvious last question. Why keep talking? Why, at the end of a ruined life, spend what breath is left warning strangers about a hollow they will never find? And the old man's answer was not about the demon at all. He said that the worst part had never been the fear. The worst part had been the loneliness of knowing. He said that once you have stood in a place the whole world insists is empty and felt it breathing, you can never again fully belong to the world that insists. You go back down the mountain, and there is the town, and the store, and the people you love, and all of it is real and warm and going on exactly as before, and you can no longer quite reach it, because a piece of you is still standing in the cold hollow in front of the open door, and it always will be. He said that the erasers had not just buried a town, they had built a whole world on top of the burial, a comfortable, well-lit, forward-looking world, and that world had no room in it for what he knew, and so knowing it had made him, in his own home, among his own people, a kind of ghost. And he said that the only cure for that loneliness he had ever found was to tell it, to hand it to someone else, so that at least he was not the only living person carrying the weight of an empty square that was not empty. So that is what he did, until he died. He handed it on. And now, through a chain of hands he never lived to see, it has come to you. You are holding it now. The weight of a hollow the maps deny, a town that drowned itself, a door that should never have been opened and can no longer be closed. You did not ask for it, exactly. You clicked on a thumbnail, but this is how it always travels, this kind of knowing. Not through official channels, which are precisely the channels built to stop it, but hand to hand, hollow to hollow, one person who refused the blank square passing it to the next. And I will be honest with you about my own place in this, because you deserve that. I cannot prove the demon. I cannot prove the drowned civilization, or the global old world, or the office that keeps the squares blank, or the light without fire, or any of the grand thread that ties the beads together. All of that is speculation, and I have tried, all the way through, to mark it as speculation, because the fastest way to discredit a true and dangerous fact is to wrap it in 10 thrilling and unprovable ones. But I can point at the beads, the stone with no tool marks, the mud that should not be there, the 3 surveys that wrote empty over a standing building, the town that ends in 3 lines of ink, the script from an ocean away, the people who went up the drainage and did not come down. Those are not my speculations. Those are the parts of the record that the record itself cannot explain, and they are enough. You do not need the demon to be afraid. You only need the blank square, and the proof that at least once the blank square was a lie. Hold the beads and refuse the thread if you want to. Hold the beads and refuse the whole official story if you dare. Either way, hold the beads. Do not let anyone talk you out of the beads. That is the one thing this entire account is really asking of you. Not belief, attention. The simple, stubborn, dangerous refusal to slide your eyes across the empty places just because you have always been told they are empty. Because somewhere, right now, that hollow is sitting at the dead end of its drainage in the blue half-light, with the stone wall running up the slope where it should stop, and the clearing where no birds sing, and the grey chapel facing away from the sunrise, buried to its windows in mud that no flood ever brought. And the door is open, and the dark behind the window is a little closer than it was, and the maps still say there is nothing there at all. They have said that for 200 years. They will keep saying it. That is their one job, and they are very good at it. But you know better now. And knowing better is the whole beginning of everything. The first small crack in a very old seal. The moment the swallowed thing starts, at last, to come back up out of the mud. One last thing, and then I will let you go, though I suspect this will not let you go quite so easily. In the years after the story began to circulate, the people who studied it the hardest, who read the transcript until they could recite it, who stared at the blurred copies of the carvings, looking for the meaning in that curling script, began to report something they were reluctant to admit to one another. They began to dream of the hollow. Not all of them, but enough of them that they eventually started comparing the dreams, and the dreams agreed with each other in a way that dreams are not supposed to. They dreamed of the stone wall running up the slope. They dreamed of the clearing with no birds. They dreamed of standing in front of the open door in the blue half-light, unable to go in and unable to leave, and of a voice, or not a voice, a pressure that spoke to them in that switched-off silence a single instruction, and the instruction was always the same. Come and see. It is empty. Come and see how empty it is. That is the oldest trick in this whole account, worn smooth by 2 centuries of use. It is the same word the surveyors wrote, empty. Come and see that there is nothing here. It is the lullaby the erased world sings to keep itself erased, and it is sung most sweetly to exactly the people who have started to suspect the truth, because those are the only people dangerous enough to need silencing. If you take nothing else from any of this, take this. When a place you have begun to wonder about starts, in any voice, in any dream, in any official document, insisting a little too gently that it is empty, that there is nothing to see, that you should let it be, that is the precise moment to look harder. Emptiness does not need to reassure you. Only a fool thing pretending to be empty ever bothers to tell you not to look. That is the story of the most demonic chapel ever found in the Appalachian Backwoods. A drowned town no one will admit died, a door that was sealed for a reason and opened for none, and a blank square on a map that turned out, when someone finally looked, to be the loudest thing on the whole page. Corvan Mill was real. The people who lived there were real. Whatever they buried themselves to trap was real enough that 40 households chose the grey mud over the alternative, and that choice, that unimaginable choice, is the truest fact in this entire account, and the one that should stay with you longest. They knew something we were never told, and they paid everything they had to make sure the rest of us would never have to know it. The 2 men with the pry bar undid that, and now it is loose in the world in the only way such things are ever really loose, as a story that will not leave you alone. If this reached something in you, if some part of you is already looking sideways at the empty places near your own home, then you are exactly the kind of person the rest of this channel is for, because we go into a different swallowed place every single week. Another blank square, another drowned town, another survivor of the old world left standing in a hollow the maps deny. Follow along, and the next one is already waiting. And remember the word you typed at the beginning, buried. Say it to yourself the next time you pass a stretch of woods that the map calls empty and the old people called something else, buried. Because now you know that the word does not mean gone, it means down there, it means waiting, it means not yet finished, and it means that the ground you walk on every day is a great deal older and a great deal fuller than anyone ever wanted you to find out. The chapel still faces the wrong way. The door is still open. The dark behind the glass is still, very slowly, coming closer. And the only thing standing between that hollow and the comfortable world you live in is the number of people willing to keep their eyes on the empty places. You are one of them now. There is no giving that back. So keep looking. It is the only thing that has ever worked.